Hey everyone, my name is Scott Clem. I'm one of our Campbell County commissioners, and I thought I'd put together a little bit of a presentation on the nuclear industry. Been having this discussion in our community about the nuclear industry and potentially what is coming to Campbell County in Gillette in particular. And so I wanted to kind of do this video format to share some of the things that I know, how I've kind of come along on this journey, and really where we go from here. So again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Clem. I served in our state legislature for 3 terms from 2015 until 2021. I chose not to run again for reelection in 2020. And then about a year ago, I was seated on the Campbell County Commission. I was appointed to fill a vacancy, and I am now uh, fulfilling the rest of this term. So this term is up this next election cycle. And so, anyway, that's a little bit about me. Well, I would say about a year ago is when I was appointed, but I want to say it was probably around November, December-ish. It was the first time that I got to sit down with one of these nuclear companies, and that was BWXT. And it wasn't just myself. We had the entire commission, met with some of the good folks at BWXT. They shared about their industry, some of the things that they were looking at, and the reason that they were looking at our community as far as a potential place where they could do business. And then fast forward to about I want to say it was probably more around March of this current year. We met with BWXT again, the entire commission, not only to kind of get an update of where they were at on things, but again to do a little bit of a refresher as far as what their business interests were and why they were looking at Campbell County, and again looking at it as a potential place where they could do business. Um, it was during that time as well that President Trump was starting to come out with some of these executive orders, particularly on the energy industry, and that was starting to position companies like BWXT, I guess, instead of being more on the back burner, I guess you could say on the front burner. Now, first of all, let me just put it out some disclaimers here. I am not speaking on behalf of BWXT or any nuclear company for that matter. I hold no investments or anything like that. I have no family members who work for these industries. I'm not gaining anything financially or otherwise. As far as sitting down and talking to these companies, as we'll see in a little bit as we go through this presentation, meeting with various companies is not an uncommon thing for the Campbell County Commission to do. In fact, just this was it yesterday, I believe it was. We sat down with a company called Cowboy Clean Technology or something. Or I can't remember what the name is. I should know that. It was just yesterday. Cowboy Clean Fuels. That's what it was. Which is a really interesting thing that they're doing, and they just wanted to keep us abreast of what is happening here in Campbell County. So all of that to say, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of any particular company or the nuclear industry. I am not an expert by any means when it comes to the nuclear industry, nor am I speaking on behalf of the entire Board of County Commissioners. I am speaking on behalf of only myself, and I am sharing my perspective and the things that I have learned as we have had some of these discussions. So that's what this presentation really is all about. I am going to kind of regurgitate everything that I know, and I'm gonna give it to you so that you have the information available to you. Same information that we're dealing with. Um, so kind of back to the story that I was telling, met with BWXT a couple of times, and then this last July, we meaning the entire county commission, we were invited to go to a place called Idaho National Laboratory. That's in Idaho Falls, Idaho. I didn't even know the place existed, let alone what it was or what it's about. It's one of, I believe, 17 national laboratories, and in particular, it has a real nuclear focus. Now, that's not their only focus, but that is one of the main points of emphasis. And so that's why we went. We were invited, and not just us. There was many people from around Wyoming. They were hosting something called Wyoming Days, and so there was people from Casper, there was people from Sweetwater County, there was, I mean, just everywhere, including Campbell County. And I think in total there was probably um, maybe about 20 of us or so. And it's not just elected officials who went. There was also people from the Wyoming Business Council, and also locally here, Energy Capital Economic Development. So a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds who went to INL, Idaho National Labs, to really learn more about the nuclear industry and learn more about nuclear science, nuclear power generation, as far as commercially. And so it is through not only the interactions that I've had in the past with, say, BWXT, but also through this trip at INL, and then of course just digging in and doing a lot more research, for myself, so that I could figure out kind of what's going on. That's kind of what's brought me to this place right here, right now. And so what I want to do here is kind of go through this presentation that I've done, and yeah, hopefully it's a benefit to you. Um, you'll be able to take away some good information. You'll know exactly what we're working with and dealing with when it comes to the county commission. Um, Again, it's not just the county commission that's really involved in this, as far as having these discussions with the business community. I know the city of Gillette is as well, but I'm not on, we're a part of the city of Gillette. And so, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of them or anybody there. I'm only speaking on behalf of myself. Once more, I am not an expert at all. The things that I share with you, I feel pretty good and comfortable about, but there's going to be some things, and I'm going to let you know, I'm not so sure exactly how this works. And so there's still unanswered questions for me. There's still more to learn. Um, but what I'm going to present to you, I believe, is factual. I'm trying to stay away from the more pro or against. I'm really trying to present this more in a neutral fashion, and just give you the information. You all, whoever's going to watch this and whoever's interested, you all can make up your own mind. And again, hopefully, you take this information and you do some more research. One more thing that I'll throw out there before we begin. I am filming this on Friday, the September the 12th. And so there was a great information session last night that was hosted by Representative John Baer. And we had John, I forget John's last name, but he was from the Nuclear Energy Institute. And then there was another guy with him. I'm horrible with names. And then there was another fellow named Bill Talon, I think is the name. And so they gave a presentation last night that was at the Senior Center. And I believe that's probably going to be floating around online for those of you who are interested in. You could go and check out those videos there on Representative John Baer's page. But on that note, there is also going to be another community event. Um, and this one is really a collaboration. It's an effort from many different entities. So myself, and Jim Ford, the mayor, Shay Lundvall, and the city administrator, and then several others from, you might say, the nuclear industry, the nuclear world. What we were trying to put together is really just more of a neutral uh, educational forum for people to come and learn more about the industry. And so that is going to be this next Thursday, and that, I believe that's the 18th, and it will be at the Gillette College Tech Center. And I believe that event is going to run from 6 to 8. And we're not only going to have some folks from the Nuclear Energy Institute, we're also going to have, I forget his name, the director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. He is going to be the one who's going to be moderating this event. We're going to have the mayor from Idaho Falls, who is going to attend that, and then there are several others. We got a good group of panelists, people, actual experts who know what they're talking about. Again, once more, I am not an expert. Um, but they are, and so they're going to have some great information to share. And so, would encourage you to go to that event. There'll be some light refreshments and whatnot. I think about a half an hour. I think the door is open and light refreshments if you want to go and chit chat. And I think there'll be the opportunity to ask some even more questions with some of the panelists who choose to stay after that event. So anyway, throw that all out there. I'm hoping that from what you get from this information, for any of you who are watching and are interested, um, that you will be able to take this information, that it will generate some more questions that you can bring to those folks at that meeting. And so I'm doing this for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I want to engage with my constituency, with the good people of Campbell County. I want to share the things that I know, and just let everybody know, like, where we're at with this process and how I'm processing all of this kind of stuff. But the second reason really is just to prime the pump for this next educational meeting, and give you at least a good cursory background knowledge so that you can bring good questions to that meeting. So with all of that out of the way, long introduction there, let's go ahead and start with this. I'll get this all teed up. Maybe. There it goes. All right. So, information on the nuclear industry. Um, there are seven main topics, or seven main questions, that this presentation is going to answer. All right, or we'll seek to answer. And I'm going to just touch on these kind of in a broad overview, and then we'll do these one by one. My goal here is, what I want to do based upon these topics, based upon these questions, is after the fact, I'll probably post this to my commissioner page, and then I'll also put some timestamps for each of these questions. So I anticipate this video is going to be pretty lengthy, but by putting those timestamps, if you want to skip ahead to a particular question that you're interested in, it'll give you the ability to do so. So the first question, the first thing that we're going to talk about, which is probably going to take the most time, is, what do we mean by nuclear technology? We're going to talk about nuclear fission. We're going to talk about the nuclear fuel cycle, what that is. So, mining, conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, the reactor itself, spent fuel and storage, recycling, and permanent disposal. So we're going to cover all of those things here. The second topic that we're going to be looking at, or the question, is, why is all this nuclear talk happening? Many of you are probably scratching your heads. All of a sudden, there's nuclear talk everywhere, and you're probably thinking to yourselves, like, where in the world is this coming from? And of course, when something comes, up out of the blue, it naturally generates some other questions from folks. They wonder, are my elected officials or something doing something in the background? Are they keeping secrets and all that? We've heard some of those kind of accusations. And again, part of the reason that I'm sharing this information with you is to just get it all on the table, and to let you know where we're at and why this nuclear talk is happening. The third thing is, we're going to talk about what is happening around the state. The fourth thing, what is happening in particular in Campbell County. So that's going to be, of course, for the good folks here in Campbell County who are watching this, that one obviously is going to be more particular to you. And really, this is geared towards my constituents here in Campbell County. But hopefully, this presentation will be of benefit for anybody in Wyoming who cares to listen, especially the first part. The next question, number 5, what does state statute say on the subject of nuclear waste, or nuclear in general? So we'll talk about that. The sixth question, what is the role of a county? In particular, what is the role of Campbell County? And has there been any decisions that have been made thus far? That's important for you to know. And you have a right to know those things. And then the last question we'll talk about is, why is there talk of nuclear waste coming to Campbell County if the US government and industry are not proposing it, and it's already illegal by state law? So that kind of feeds into the previous questions there. You can kind of see where that's going, but we'll raise that last question and we'll talk about that as well. All right, so let's go on and talk about what we mean by nuclear technology. Let me just make this full screen here for you for just a moment so you can see this. What do we mean? Many of you are aware of, or you have at least heard the terms of fission or fusion. And really, what we're talking about with nuclear technology is we're talking about the splitting of atoms. That is nuclear fission. It is when an atom separates, and that separation releases a lot of energy. And that energy is then captured, in particular, when we're talking about the commercial nuclear industry, power generation. That energy of splitting those atoms, it's captured and it's put to work. It's made useful for you and I when it comes to electricity. And and when you think about the nuclear industry or nuclear power generation, and we'll talk about more of this later on when we talk about reactors themselves. Um, but it's not all that different from, say, coal-fired power generation. It's essentially it's a different way of heating up water. And what I mean by that, we think about the different power plants that surround us. I can look to the east here, and I can see Wyandotte. I can look to the north. I can see Dry Fork. So there's these coal-fired power plants all over the place. And generally, how that works is you take a fuel source, in particular coal around here. You burn that in order to boil water. That boiled water turns into steam, and then you use that steam to turn a turbine, and then that turbine, by turning, generates electricity. And there you go. There you have it. And there's lots of different ways you can boil water. You can boil water with coal. You can boil water with natural gas. The natural gas is a little bit different. Natural gas operates on something called a gas turbine. So think like of a jet airliner. It's a turbine, um, and it's that's just what it's called. It's called a gas turbine. But you can also combine that with a steam turbine and have something called a combined cycle, which leads to greater efficiency. But essentially, again, it's you're doing the same thing. You're using a fuel source in order to generate some kind of airflow, um, in which then that turns a turbine and it generates electricity. And it's the same thing with the nuclear industry. So there's like 90 some, I think it was like 92 nuclear reactors in the United States. It's about 20% of the uh, power generation that we have in our nation. And I think all of those, or the majority anyway, the vast majority, um, are what's called a light water reactor, and it's essentially all you're doing is you're taking atoms, and you are fissioning them, you are splitting them, and that releases energy in the form of heat. That heat then boils water, which then turns to steam, which then goes through a turbine and turns the turbine, and the next thing you know, you have electricity. All right, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. Um, there's also something called fusion as well, and that is what happens in the sun, where you're not splitting atoms apart, but you're actually you're conjoining them. And that's our sun is a giant nuclear reactor in that respect, in that it's running off of fusion. Um, we haven't mastered fusion yet. There's lots of research. There's lots of cool things and that people are doing, and it's kind of like the holy grail, because you're talking about, if you can master fusion, it's really, they're saying anyway, an unlimited power source, which would be pretty incredible when we think about the future and what may come. But we're not there yet. We got a ways to go. But fission is something that we've been doing. Um, and when we're talking about the nuclear industry in particular, we're talking about the splitting of a particular atom, and that is uranium 235 or U-235, as you see on the screen there. It is called an isotope. Now, what is an isotope? Well, let's go back to maybe some high school chemistry, and I had to brush up on things. So if you're not aware, don't feel bad. That's why we're doing some of this. An isotope has the same atomic number, meaning it has the same number of protons. So if you look on your screen here, and you can kind of see the periodic table, or half of it anyway, and right down here at the bottom, right in the middle there, you see uranium, and its proton number is 92. the number of protons is what gives each element it's what makes it distinct. Now you can have, of course, when we think of atoms, you not only have protons, but you have also something called neutrons. Protons and neutrons make up the nucleus of an atom, and then of course, then surrounding that you have electrons. Well, you can have an element that it's always going to have the same number of protons, right? So uranium is always going to have 92 protons, but it can have varying numbers of neutrons. And uh, and those that you kind of have what is considered normal, I guess you might say, or standard. And those different elements that have varying numbers of neutrons, those are called isotopes. Um, and so uranium-235 is an isotope of uranium. Uranium, just kind of in general, is uranium-238. That's what comes up out of the ground. So we do mining here, and we mine lots of uranium here in Campbell County. And when it comes up out of the ground, 99.27% of it is uranium-238. So the vast majority. It has 92 protons, because that's what makes it uranium, and it has 146 neutrons. Uranium-235, this isotope, again, it has 92 protons, but it has 143 neutrons. So it has 3 less than, your normal average uranium. And it consists about, well, it's less than a percent. It's 0.711% of what comes out of the ground. All right. And uranium-235 is the fissile isotope that is used in reactors, and it's used in weapons, so nuclear weapons. All right. So that's what we're talking about, just to kind of get a baseline here. Also wanted to point out one thing here. You're going to see this on the screen. It's going to do a little circle thing. There it goes. Um, you'll hear me use the word transuranics. And transuranics are elements that are above uranium, so they are heavier than uranium. And these include things like neptunium, I think that's how you pronounce that, plutonium, americium, I think that's how you pronounce that. So these that you kind of see down there circled, they're above uranium in the periodic table. And if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong on this, I wasn't really prepared for this, it's just coming to mind. I believe uranium is the heaviest natural element that we can find. These other things like neptunium and plutonium and americium or whatever, those things, if I'm not mistaken, those things are man-made. They're produced through our activity, but I believe uranium is naturally the heaviest. I could be wrong on that, so you can fact check me on that, and let me know if I'm wrong. I'd certainly appreciate that. All right, let's go to the next slide here. Let's talk about nuclear fission in particular. So what happens in a nuclear reactor? What happens in a nuclear weapon? We're really talking about the same kind of process. One is more controlled, i.e., what happens in a nuclear reactor for commercial power generation, versus something that is uncontrolled, which we would consider a nuclear weapon. So, what happens in a nuclear reaction? Well, as you can see here up in your screen, um, you've got this little dot here on the left, and kind of in the middle of the screen. It's right next to the uranium-235, and that dot there is supposed to represent a neutron, a single neutron. And what happens in a nuclear reaction is a single neutron, or a stream of neutrons, is fired at uranium-235. What happens then is, by the way, those neutrons are going at incredible speeds. And so that neutron then is absorbed into the nucleus, right? So the 92 protons, the 143 neutrons that are also there, it's absorbed. So now this element has 144 neutrons, it becomes uranium-236. And uranium-236 is unstable. It can't continue to stay in that state. And so what happens then is the uranium-236, it splits violently, and it releases this energy. That energy that we talked about, it is heat, and that's the things that heats up the water, that turns into steam, and so on and so forth. So it splits violently, it releases this energy, and in so doing, when this uranium 236, excuse me, it splits into two other elements. So you got barium 141 up here, and you got krypton 92 down here. Now these are both radioactive. These are nasty little buggers, and so the uranium, it splits into those two different elements, and that it also releases two or three um, uh, fast neutrons. So in other words, you fire a neutron into uranium 235, it absorbs it, it splits into these two smaller nuclei, barium and krypton, and then it fires two or three additional fast neutrons. And so then those additional fast neutrons, then they go out, and they go out and hit more uranium 235. And then what you have here really is a chain reaction. Now, when you have enough material, when you have enough critical mass of uranium 235, that chain reaction can happen all at once, and it can happen really fast, and it's a violent explosion, and we know that to be a nuclear weapon. And that's what we created during World War II. That's what helped stop. It helped stop the war, as far as causing the Japanese to surrender. And of course, we weren't using necessarily uranium 235. We were using a different element. We were using plutonium. Those were plutonium bombs, but it's kind of the same general idea. Now, when we're talking about modern day atomic weapons, so what do they call them? Neutron bombs, I think is what they're called. You actually have a couple of different processes all at once. You have a plutonium bomb, but you also have this they call it a hydrogen bomb, and it's crazy stuff. And it's all designed to kill people. Uh, Scientists after World War II were thinking to themselves, we use this technology to cause a lot of death. Is there a way that we can control the chain reaction, so that instead of causing death, we can put it to work, and it can be productive for human life? And that's exactly what they did. They invented what we would call, nuclear power generation, and it's by controlling this chain reaction. All right, and we'll talk about that. I think more here in a little bit when we talk about some of these other things, but we'll move on to the next slide to keep things moving. So what you see here on the screen now, this is a picture of the nuclear fuel cycle. When we're talking about the nuclear fuel cycle, we're not just talking about what happens in a reactor. That is one small part of a bigger chain of events, you might say, that constitutes the entire nuclear fuel cycle. And it starts with mining, and it ends with some kind of disposal. And so you can kind of see that here. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn, and kind of what's going on in the United States today, and what that may mean for Campbell County and also Wyoming. And so you can kind of see these blue boxes up here, and I just want to point these out. When we're talking about mining and milling and conversion, enrichment and fuel fabrication, all of these things, a lot of people call this the front end of the fuel cycle. And it's important to distinguish this, because these things right here, mining, milling, conversion, enrichment, fuel fabrication, none of these things here, none of them produce high level, nuclear waste. And that's one of those important distinctions that we need to remember. And we're going to talk more about what potentially may come to Campbell County, and I'll just say it now, and you'll hear me say it again. The opportunities that have presented themselves before us today do not involve anything on the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. In other words, they don't involve anything with respect to interim storage or fuel reprocessing, recycling, or final disposition. So putting, you hear a lot of talk today about, people saying that Wyoming's gonna become a nuclear dumping ground for the rest of the nation. And I just want to make that clear that the things that have presented themselves to Campbell County really involve the front end of the fuel cycle, which doesn't have anything to do with the storage of that waste. And we'll talk about more of this in just a second. So you got the front end of the fuel cycle, you got the back end of the fuel cycle. We'll talk about this more, but here's another chart just looks a little bit different. And again, you have the same thing. You got uranium mines and mills. You got your conversion to uranium hexafluoride, which is a gas. We'll talk about that. You have to enrich that gas. Then you have to take that enriched material and you have to convert that to a usable fuel form. That usable fuel form goes into a reactor. After it is used, it is spent fuel, and so it has to be stored somewhere, and it's going to be stored on site of where the nuclear reactor is. And then ultimately, it needs to have some kind of permanent home for waste because it lasts a really, really long time. We'll talk about that. And what I've just kind of described to you here, and you'll see the little arrow there or the little red line. That is the fuel cycle that we have in the United States of America today, and this is called an open fuel cycle. In other words, we take uranium, we take uranium that we mine, we make it into a usable fuel form, we use it once, and then we throw it away and we dispose of it. There is something else that we could do with it, and America actually used to do this, and that is something called the closed fuel cycle, and that involves some recycling, some reprocessing. So after you get, your spent fuel, it can actually be reprocessed. It can be recycled, and I believe 96% of it can be recycled. And it can be turned into more fuel, then used at a reactor, and you can do this over and over and over again, and that is called a closed fuel cycle. Again, we used to do that in America. That was, we have the technology. I think it's important to point that out. We have the technology. America invented the technology, back in the 50s and 60s to reprocess and recycle used nuclear waste. You said, well, why don't we do that anymore? And really, we don't do that because Jimmy Carter, and I think it was around 1977, essentially made the decision that our country was not going to do that anymore, and for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a whole lot cheaper to mine fresh uranium and do all of this stuff and dispose of it versus the recycling part of it. And the second thing there is involve nuclear proliferation. With some of the recycling and reprocessing, you also have plutonium. Now that plutonium can be used again in fuel. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But during that era, in a period of, there's a lot of talk of nuclear proliferation and whatnot, and so really for political reasons, we abandoned anything to do with the reprocessing and recycling of nuclear fuel. So we'll talk more about all of those things in a moment. So let's start with the first one here. We're just going to work through every one of these again to give you an idea of what exactly this entails, and try to have some kind of nexus here to Campbell County and Wyoming. So first of all is uranium mines and mills. Let's go ahead and talk about that. You can see here on this map here, this is the uranium resources that we have in the United States. And we have a lot of uranium in Wyoming. In fact, Wyoming is sitting on the largest reserves of uranium in the United States. And that's That's a pretty cool thing. I mean, we are mineral rich in all sorts of things, whether it's coal, oil, gas, and uranium as well. And we have uranium mining that goes on to this day. In fact, we've been mining uranium since the 1950s, out by the Pumpkin Buttes. And we use something called in situ mining or in situ recovery. And essentially, what that is you take a liquid, and you pump it, you inject it into the ground via these wells. The liquid then dissolves uranium, and that liquid then, which contains dissolved uranium, is then pumped to the surface. Obviously, you separate the water, so turn this thing back into a solid, and you have your uranium ore, and that's how we do things today, which is a good thing as well. Of course, with any kind of mining activity, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's coal, oil, gas, or uranium. Obviously, when you are digging things out of the ground, there is a potential for some kind of environmental impact. And we have learned through the years, things that have worked and have not worked. Now, uranium naturally in the ground is radioactive. It just naturally is that way. And so there's necessary precautions that need to be taken when it comes to in situ mining, or any kind of mining for that matter, because we want to, of course, protect our water tables. We want to protect our wildlife. We want to protect our environment, and overall, right, we want to protect the safety of human beings. Um, you know, we live here in Wyoming. We work here. We eat here. We play here. And we want to make sure that we are safe in our own land. And so we take safety very serious when it comes to all sorts of different mining activity. And man, you think about just where the safety and where, you know, we always talk about, regulation is just as if that's sometimes a bad thing, and sometimes it is when we overregulate. But man, I'm thankful for good, necessary regulation. Just I'll say this, and this is, my opinion here. But there is a role for government when it comes to interacting with businesses, whether it's with the nuclear industry with mining uranium, or whether it's with the coal industry, and that is to ensure that the risks, and the hazards that could come from potential industrial activity, that those risks and hazards to the environment and to people, that they are mitigated, and that the companies who are involved in the activity are not only legally responsible, but they're also financially responsible, and that you know the risks and the hazards and the potential things, and mitigating all of those things, that doesn't land on the back of the taxpayers, because it shouldn't. And so there is definitely a role for government. So that's what we've got going on in Wyoming today. Certainly, and you're going to hear about this more in a moment, there is definitely an uptick when it comes to the potential for nuclear energy. And there's really good reasons for that, notably because of the executive orders that President Trump has put out. Right now, we are the number 2 uranium producer in the United States. We overtook Texas. And Utah has this beat right now, but it really sounds like that Wyoming is going to become number 1, and that's good. That's good for our economy. That's good for the mining industry, in particular here in Campbell County. So once you mine that material, you've got this ore. Of course, you separate the liquid from the uranium ore. There's the uranium mines and mills. Kind of the milling part of that is it's turned into a substance called yellowcake, and many of you have heard that. But just having yellowcake, that doesn't mean you have a usable fuel source. And again, part of the reason for that is, remember, when uranium comes up out of the ground, it's over 99% of it is uranium-238, which is not the right isotope you need for nuclear fission. You need that uranium-235. And so somehow you got to take that 0.7% of uranium-235, and you have to enrich that. You have to make more of that so that you have good fissile material. And that's where some of this other process comes in. So the first thing they do is they convert it. They turn it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride. Um, and so, and you can kind of see a picture of it there. The reason that it's gasified, it's turned into a gas, is because when it comes to the next step of the process, which is enrichment, it's a whole lot easier to enrich a gas, and to separate the uranium 235 from the uranium 238. It's easier to do that in a gasified form than it is in a liquefied form, or a solid form. And so you have to have some kind of mechanism where you turn that yellow cake into a gas. And right now in the United States, there is only one operation in the entire United States that does this conversion, this uranium hexafluoride conversion plant, and that is the Honeywell Metropolis Works in Metropolis, Illinois. Um, Now, as we're going to see here in a little bit, and I'll just kind of tee this up now. As a result of the actions that President Carter took, our our entire nuclear industry has severely atrophied. In other words, there's a reason that we only have one conversion plant in the United States, and that is not near enough for um, for the demands of the future as far as the nuclear industry. And President Trump, recognizing that, has made that a priority, and that's part of his executive orders. And so there's a brand new company that is proposing a new plant in Wyoming or Texas. Now, I don't know much about this. I don't know where in Wyoming. In fact, as I was doing some research for this, I noticed this. It's the first I've actually heard, but I read it on the internet. Right? Not everything on the internet is true, but I do believe this is factual. But anyway, it's Uranium Energy Corporation. From the research that I read, that's proposing a new plant in Wyoming or Texas. I have no idea where in Wyoming. If they were looking at Campbell County, well, it's news to me, because we haven't met with anybody. But that doesn't mean that they aren't either. I'll just throw that out there. There is no requirement for any private business to meet with local government officials. Mm, you know, it's nice when they do, but there's no requirement. So wherever they're looking, there's going to be a new uranium uh, conversion plant for to gasify the yellow cake into uranium hexafluoride. And really, what Trump wants to do is he wants to quadruple the domestic nuclear capacity to reduce reliance on foreign conversion services. And that's part of the problem today is, there is existing demand with our existing nuclear fleet. The problem is we are relying uh, upon foreign activity, and sometimes by adversaries like Russia, right? Which we're not on the best of terms with Russia at the moment, and so you can see how that is a problem. So President Trump wants to onshore and beef up the nuclear industry so that we are more self-reliant, self-sustainable. And that has a national security implication right there alone. So the next stop on the chain here is uranium enrichment. So once you have that gas, that gas then needs to be enriched, and this is where the enrichment facility comes in. So let's talk about this a little bit. So the enrichment of uranium 235. So the uranium hexafluoride, the UF6 gas, is put into a centrifuge. And these centrifuges, they spin at 1,500 revolutions per second, and the amount of force of that is, as I read, is hundreds of thousands of times stronger than gravity, and that is an incredible amount of force. And there's a good reason for that. Uranium 238 and uranium 235, the mass difference is merely 3 neutrons. I mean, they're pretty much the same except those 3 neutrons, and so you have to have a force significant enough so that you can separate the uranium 238 from the uranium-235. And what happens in these centrifuges is they spin so fast, this gas spins so fast that the uranium-238, it gravitates towards the outside of the centrifuge, while the uranium-235 stays more in the middle. And it's through that process then that they're able to collect, they're able to enrich their uranium-235 to an appropriate level. There's one facility that does this in the United States, again, just one, and that is called Urenco, and that is in New Mexico. But recently, as again a result of President Trump's executive orders, there is a new multi-billion-dollar facility that is, and in fact, just recently they announced that it is going to go in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And so, again, the purpose of that is so that we are self-reliant, self-sustaining. Really, a lot of this is for national security purposes, and we'll talk about that more later. You can see that you can have various enrichment levels depending on the application, depending on what you want to do. So again, natural uranium right here, freshly mined, it's going to be 0.711% of uranium-235. But in order for that to be useful, whether it's in a reactor or a nuclear weapon or whatever, you have to enrich that to an appropriate level. In the power plants that we have today, the light water reactors, the existing fleet of reactors that we have right now, that uranium-235 is enriched to 3 to 5%, which is not much, right? So you're talking, at maximum 5% uranium-235, and 95% of it is still uranium-238. And this is what produces a nuclear reaction in one of our nuclear power plants today. That's what our commercial reactors use. This 3 to 5% is called low enriched uranium. So if you hear of low enriched uranium, it's talking about enriched to 3 to 5%, which is what the current fleet uses. If we go a level up from that, there's something called high assay low enriched uranium, or sometimes known as HALEU. And HALEU is enriched from 5 to 20%. And I hear numbers like 19 points, something percent. And essentially that's the number that's used, and we're going to talk about this later on in a new fuel form called triso fuel, and we'll talk about that. But this is the number that's needed, around 20% for triso fuel, and it's called HALEU, high assay low enriched uranium. So this isn't high enriched uranium; it's low enriched uranium, but it's a higher assay of that, I guess. And then you have highly enriched uranium, and the highly enriched uranium is it's enriched anywhere from 90% plus, right? And so this 90% plus is what's needed, or it's what's used in our naval reactors. So you think of our existing nuclear fleet. We have nuclear submarines, and they have nuclear reactors in them, and they're pretty small nuclear reactors, and they can stay going for 30 years. I mean, it's incredible. They don't have to refuel for that long. We've got aircraft carriers as well. They can do the same thing. And so I think this number is actually classified. I don't think anybody really knows what it is, but the estimates anyway are 90% plus is what's used in our naval fleet. But this is what's also used in nuclear weapons. You cannot produce a nuclear weapon unless it's enriched to 90% plus. So in other words, low enriched uranium or HALEU uranium, up to 20%, that's not going to produce a nuclear weapon. It just won't. The physics won't allow it. You need to enrich that uranium-235 to a sufficient amount to where it's 90% or better. All right. So after you enrich the uranium, you've got the gas, it goes into the centrifuges, it spins, it separates the U-235 from the uranium-238. You get a concentration of the uranium-235, but it's still a gas. And so now you have to convert that gas into a usable fuel form, and that's the next step in the process. By the way, every single one of these things, right, on the front end of the fuel cycle, what we're talking about in particular here, these are all separate business opportunities. These are things that the private industry is doing or can do. And in the case of President Trump and what he's wanting to see with the nuclear industry, these are things that is severely atrophied. And so it's almost like we're building back the nuclear program from the ground up, because we've let it fall into really a state of disrepair. So you take the enriched uranium hexafluoride gas, it's converted into a solid ceramic. So it's called uranium dioxide, and it's a powder. So you can see the powder there on the screen. And then that powder then is pressed into a cylindrical fuel pellet, and it's about the size of a a fingertip. And you can see that here on the right hand side. You can see someone's holding up a coin, and you can see there's two little pellets there that are inside of this fuel rod. And these fuel rods, these are zirconium alloy tubes. These fuel rods, they take these pellets and they put these, they put the pellets inside of the fuel rods, and then they assemble those fuel rods, a bunch of them together, into a fuel assembly. So you can see that there on the left hand side as well. I got a picture here for you, which is kind of cool. Um, when we went to Washington, D.C., I forgot to mention that. We went to Washington, D.C. This last February, for various reasons. We were talking to our federal partners, at the BLM, the Forest Service and the Department of Energy. And, when it comes to Campbell County, and in particular when it comes to our coal industry, um, I like what former commissioner. Oh, what's his name? I'm thinking of his name. His face is in my mind. Oh, horrible with names. It's evading me. Anyway, he used to say this, and he heard it, I think, from somewhere else. If you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And that's kind of true, especially when it comes to our coal industry. So many, many years ago, about a decade or more ago, our county commission thought it would be prudent that we actually need to be talking to our federal partners for the protection of our coal industry. And so that is continued. So when we were in Washington, D.C. this last year, we were meeting with the Department of Energy, and in particular, we were talking about the nuclear industry, and they brought out this fuel assembly, and so that's kind of a mock-up, a prototype of that. This is not the actual size. I mean, it's the actual size as far as some of it, but add another 8 to 10 feet. These things are super, super long. And these fuel assemblies loaded up with this uranium dioxide, these pellets, this fuel, this is what is loaded into the core of a uranium or a nuclear reactor. This is the core. This is what they're talking about. I don't know about you. I didn't know a whole lot about the nuclear industry prior to any of this. Prior to my time of being on the commission, didn't really need to. When I thought of nuclear waste in particular, I kind of had the Simpsons caricature. I didn't necessarily think it may be like glowing green ooze, but I did think it was a liquid. And it turns out, uranium, or spent nuclear fuel and waste, it's not a liquid at all. It's solid. It stays in these fuel assemblies. It's just they're irradiated. The content changes as a result of the nuclear reactors, which we'll talk about, or nuclear reaction, as we'll talk about more in just a moment. But it stays inside of this fuel assembly, and it's this fuel assembly right here. This is what ends up going into waste. I mean, the whole thing, the tubes and all. So anyway, that's kind of that. There's another fuel form though that I want to mention, and this is something more on kind of the cutting edge as far as advanced technology, which is kind of strange when you talk about this, because a lot of the things as far as the advancements in technology that we have today, turns out we invented, that is the America, we invented a lot of this stuff in the 1960s, the 1950s, right? So some of this stuff is actually really old, and this is one of them. Triso fuel. It's called tristructural isotropic fuel. Say that 5 times fast. Trisul fuel for short. It was developed in the 1960s, and then it was improved upon in 2002 and beyond. And so that's really where the advancement in technology comes in. But it was never really commercialized. In other words, the regular fuel that is used still in our existing fleet of nuclear power plants is those uranium dioxide pellets, right? It's that powder that's squished into a pellet and put into those fuel rods. And this is a different type of fuel. You can see here's kind of a picture of it here. And of course, that's not to size. It's actually the size of a poppy seed. So super, super, super tiny. And what it is it's a kernel of uranium. So same thing, uranium dioxide. You still have to take that gas, convert it into a solid. So this would be uranium dioxide, a kernel of it. But then it's encapsulated with 3 layers of carbon and ceramic-based materials to prevent the release of radioactive fission products. Let me put it to you like this. We all remember Chernobyl, right? Chernobyl is one of the worst accidents, the nuclear accidents that has ever taken place. Uh, the reason, one of the reasons that Chernobyl was so bad, there's really a couple of them. One of them was the moderator that it was using, which no one uses those kind of moderators today, but that's besides the point. Um, One of the issues is the Soviets were too cheap to put a containment dome around the facility. If you look at any nuclear reactor in the United States or really anywhere in the world, you're going to notice it's within a dome type structure, and there is a reason for that. And that dome is it's a really a protective layer of concrete, and it's not just visibly what you see as far as as you're looking at one. It actually goes underground. It surrounds the entire reactor, this containment dome. And the reason for that is in light water reactors today, you have contents under pressure. You have steam, right? If you were to have any kind of explosion, it wouldn't be a nuclear explosion, right? Because the enrichment level is not high enough. But you could have a chemical explosion or something else like what happened in Chernobyl. Chernobyl was actually a chemical explosion. Um, but what happens is if you have some kind of an explosion, you have the propensity then to release nuclear radioactive material into the surrounding area. Well, the Soviets, like I said, were too cheap to put a containment dome, and so when the accident happened, you had nuclear material that went everywhere. Um, the reason that we have those containment domes today is so that if something bad happens, worst case scenario, that it is contained within that dome. It's contained within that specific area. And that's kind of the long and short of it. They did eventually put a containment dome around Chernobyl, but they did it after the fact, had to do a lot of fancy engineering and costs way more than if they would have done it right the first time. I mentioned that because essentially what these layers that encapsulate this kernel of of uranium, it acts as a miniature containment dome. It keeps all of the radioactive material locked inside of these tiny particles that are the size of a poppy seed. And so essentially what you have is you have these different layers. So the first layer, and you can kind of see it here, is kind of a mock-up, and I'm not sure if these all correspond exactly. But the first layer that surrounds the kernel of uranium is a buffer of porous carbon for kernel swelling, right? So when a nuclear reaction happens, obviously the uranium is going to heat up, and we all know that as things heat up, they expand, and so you have to have some give within the material, and so that's what that first buffer of porous carbon really is for. It's to allow allow the material to move, within the particle here. The next layer, it's called the inner polycarbon. Is I think is the name of it. IPYC, inner polycarbon, and it's a dense layer of carbon, and it's there to protect the kernel from corrosive gases. All right. So again, we're talking about different protective layers that really act as a containment dome. The next layer is something called silicon carbide. And the silicon carbide is a high density, high strength layer that acts as as a pressure vessel. So this is like the containment dome. Um, and it's incredible, this material. And I'm not going to go into all the the science facts about it. A person could geek out if they're interested in something like that. Suffice it to say that trisul fuel has been run through the ringer. Scientists have tested this fuel. They have put it through rigorous testings to test it to the point where it fails. They want to know all of its limitations, what it can handle, what it can't handle, and it's really an incredible fuel. And then the last layer here is the outer polycarbon layer, and it's a high density carbon layer to protect the fuel particle during the formation of fuel compact. What do we mean by that? What ends up happening, and you can kind of see, here's another picture of it, of a trisul particle, and you can see the different layers. Essentially what happens is these poppy seed size kernels is you take a bunch of them, and I think someone said maybe 1,000 of them. In any event, you take those and you do kind of what you do with the old version of the fuel, the old generation. And that is you form them together, you give it a squish, and you form it into these pellets. You say, well, isn't it going to bust these layers if you squish it together? That was my first thought, but that's part of that outer polycarbon layer. And again, the silicon carbide is extremely tough. And so they form these pellets, and again, these pellets can then be loaded into fuel rod assemblies, and away you go. They can also be formed into these bigger pebbles, you might say. There's different things that you can do with this fuel. But one of the advantages to this kind of fuel right here, again, is you have taken a containment dome, and you have miniaturized it to keep all of the nasties, if we can call it that. You keep all of that locked inside. So it's pretty incredible, and this is where a lot of the technology is going today, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. Reactor. In fact, maybe I'll just mention it here, because I don't know if I have it mentioned anywhere else in this presentation. One of the things that BWXT is interested in doing is actually making a production facility, a manufacturing plant for this fuel. Because this is where the technology and where future generations of nuclear reactors are going. They're going to use this fuel. Currently, there is, I think, one facility in the United States that does make trisul fuel, but it doesn't make it on a level that makes it commercially viable. And so really, this is kind of this brand new opportunity. And BWXT, and this isn't any secret, it's not proprietary information or anything like that. You can find it online. It was mentioned last night in the at the town hall thing that Representative Bear put on. The BWXT is looking for a potential site to place a fuel fabrication facility for trisul fuel in particular, to take that uranium hexafluoride gas that's then converted into a solid, uranium dioxide, and then you have to then further fabricate that into a usable fuel form, this trisul fuel. And so they've looked at Campbell County as one of those potential places to site a facility. Now, Campbell County is in the running with other places as well. BWXT, as of the date of this video anyway, they have not made any firm decisions. They haven't made any commitments. And so, there's no guarantee that it will even come to Campbell County. I think there's another place. I think that same place in Tennessee, Oak Ridge, if I'm not mistaken, the same place where they're doing um, they're putting the enrichment facility. I think Oak Ridge, if I'm not mistaken, is also in the running to place a facility such as this. All right. Um, After you have the fuel fabricated, so again, front end of the fuel cycle, all of that work has to be done in order to make it into a usable fuel form, this fissile material, this uranium 235, and then it's finally put into a reactor. So let's talk a little bit about reactors. When we went to Idaho National Laboratory, one of the fun facts, one of the things I didn't know about is that um, Idaho National Labs in Idaho Falls, Idaho, this is the location of the first commercial power generation plant that has ever existed. And it's called EBR1. You're looking at it right here. It's now turned into a museum. But it's called the I think it's external breeder reactor number 1. I believe that's right. Maybe I got the E wrong. I believe that's what it is. External EBR1. We'll just call it that. It's a breeder reactor, and it's the first one. And here's a picture of the inside. This is actually, you're looking at the where they had the core. So if you were to go on kind of that top where the railing is, and you go in towards the center, they would stick that fuel rod assembly, and it would go deep in there, and that's where this the core was, and this is the first place that generated electricity. So it's pretty incredible. It's an awesome place to visit if you ever get a chance. And there's some cool videos you can also find online. If you look up EBR1, it's cool. You can geek out over that kind of thing if that's the kind of thing you're interested in. So let's talk about some nuclear reactors here for just a moment. Um, there are different kinds of nuclear reactors. In fact, the EBR1, that breeder reactor, was called it was called a fast reactor. So you have fast reactors and you have light water reactors. Sometimes light water reactors are called thermal reactors. Um, and light water reactors is what we have in the United States. That's our existing nuclear fleet. The difference between a fast reactor and a light water or thermal reactor is how they manage the neutron behavior, how they utilize the fuel, and the cooling systems. All right, so and again, this is where as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's some things that I just don't really have quite a handle on, and this is one of those things. I'm telling you things that I've learned, but I still don't know if I quite understand the science between a fast reactor and a light water reactor. All I know is there is a difference, and some of those differences are pretty obvious, and we'll go over those. So light water reactors, they use water as a coolant and as a moderator, and they are under pressure. Remember back to that example, where we saw nuclear fission, and you had the neutron that shot into the uranium 235. It splits into these subparticles, and then it shoots out 3 other fast neutrons. Um, a fast reactor is able to utilize those fast neutrons in a controlled way to sustain a chain reaction, and not only to produce energy, but actually to produce its own fuel. And we'll get to that more in just a second. In light water reactors, though, the process is different. Those fast neutrons, and they're called fast because they go fast. Um, if if not controlled right, if you don't have the right quantity of fuel and all that, as I understand it, you cannot sustain a reaction with those fast neutrons. In other words, those neutrons go so fast that it kills the reaction, and the reaction doesn't sustain itself. And so in light water or thermal reactors, what happens is you have water, which is not only the coolant, it also serves as the moderator. In other words, that water slows down those fast neutrons, and it slows them down enough to help manage that neutron behavior to sustain the chain reaction. And that's probably about as much as I can say on that, um, without saying something really dumb. And hopefully, I didn't mess that up. For those of you who know better than I, please correct me if I'm wrong. It uses thermal neutrons, and like I said, it slows the speed of fast neutrons to control those nuclear reactions. A light water reactor has low fuel efficiency. It only uses uranium-235. So these are some of the drawbacks. It's not as efficient. It can only use uranium-235. Not only that, but it also produces a significant amount of long-lived nuclear waste. And of course, we're dealing with that today. All of these, these nuclear power plants, they keep the nuclear waste on site, and it's piling up, and we have to do something with it. And that's part of the problem when it comes to nuclear technologies. What do you do with the waste? And we'll get to that here in just a moment. But the light water reactors in particular, it produces this waste. And so it's it's not the best. Fast reactors, which is what EBR-1 was, is actually you might call it a more sophisticated reactor. Fast reactors have no moderator. In other words, you don't need water, or any other moderator for that reason. You do need some kind of a coolant, right? And so many of these fast reactors, they use other different types of coolants. They use liquid metal molten salts, for instance, or liquid metal. They use liquid metal or molten salts or inert gases to cool. Not only that, but these fast reactors are under low pressure. So light water reactors, you have of course high pressure. You're dealing with steam, but that's not the case with these fast reactors. These fast reactors they're not pressurized. They can be used, in regular atmospheric conditions, which again is one of their advantages. They use fast neutrons. They're able to utilize the speed, you might say, of the neutrons, and they're able to control reactions that way. They can be mixed. They can use mixed oxide fuel and spent fuel. So here, get this. This is kind of the crazy thing, right? You can actually take spent fuel, and that fuel can be used in a fast reactor. So in other words, instead of storing it, and throwing it away, and burying it deep down in a hole somewhere, you can actually that spent fuel can actually be turned into an asset to where these fast reactors actually use that. And as a result, it produces less waste. It actually burns up the transuranics. Remember, we talked about those at the beginning. It burns up the transuranics. It burns up some of those longer lived nuclides, whatever. I can't say the word. But those long-lived radioactive materials, the things that live for hundreds of thousands of years as far as their half-lives, fast reactors can actually burn those things up. In fact, what's really incredible about this fast reactor technology, and again, we developed this stuff back in the 50s. The cool thing about that is you can actually take nuclear waste that, you might have to bury in the ground for tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years before it becomes safe. And with a fast reactor, you can burn up those longer lived isotopes to where it only needs to be in the ground for a few hundred years. You know, it's quite the difference. I wanted to throw up. Where is it at? I'm going to throw up a different part of the screen here because there is something that I wanted to show. I was reading about this a little bit. So this is as it says here. I was looking it up. What is a fast reactor? Because I was trying to figure out the difference between these things. And like I said, I'm still not 100% sure I understand all the ins and outs between thermal reactors or light water reactors, and a fast reactor. One of the cool things that I read on here in this article, and I'll just bring it here. I'm going to start here in the middle. It says, you read that right. Fast reactors produce energy. Can you see that on the screen? Yeah. Fast reactors produce energy using recycled nuclear waste and generate new fuel in the process by transforming uranium-238 into plutonium-239. This is called transmutation. Fast reactors utilize high-energy neutrons that collide in a controlled chain reaction, generating a ton of heat energy. Believe it or not, the first ever U.S. power reactor was a fast reactor. That was EBR-1. Its successor, EBR-2, which was also at Idaho National Labs, was awesome. Of course, this is in the opinion of this person, right? It recycled nuclear waste and even did a test to show it was meltdown proof purely by the physics of the reactor. That's one of the things about fast reactors is the way these things are designed. That's one of the advanced safety features, and we'll talk more about that. It's some people call it passively safe or walk-away safe. It goes on and it says it ran for 30 years, and a lot of what we have learned from it is being applied to current projects like Oklo, TerraPower's Natrium, and Marvel. Now, I wanted to bring that up because we're going to talk about TerraPower, the project Natrium. You might have heard of that because that's what's going on in Wyoming. That's what's going on in Kemmerer. That's the nuclear plant that they're building right now is the Natrium plant. And the Natrium plant is modeled after this fast reactor technology that can actually utilize nuclear waste as fuel. So it not only burns up in all of the nasties, so that you can you're still going to have nuclear waste, but now you have something that may last a few hundred years versus hundreds of thousands of years. Not only that, but it breeds its own fuel, which is the incredible thing about that. Again, this is the stuff that President Carter stopped in the 1970s. And in my opinion, anyway, it was really more political than anything else. Okay, let me go back to the screen. The other one. All right, so that's a little bit of the difference there between these different types of reactors. There's another way that we can look at these reactors, and that is you'll sometimes hear the classification of generations. So generation 1 reactor, a generation 2 reactor, a generation 3, a generation 3 plus, and then a generation 4 reactor. And this really goes along with how technology is advanced throughout the years. And so you can kind of see it up here. There's a timeline, from the 1950s to the 60s. So the first reactors that we built, these are Gen 1. These were proof of concept. They were early commercial use. They weren't the greatest. They had low power output. They had basic safety systems, and now they are mostly decommissioned. Generation 2 reactors you have, and these were built from the 1970s to the 1990s, and we have a lot of these today. This is what pretty much our nuclear fleet that we have today. A lot of these are Generation 2, and maybe they've had some upgrades to move them up to Generation 3, but maybe not. So these are commercial workhorses, right? These are reliable. They provide standardized electricity generation. They used active safety systems. So, talking like pumps and valves. They use low enriched uranium, and they're still dominant globally and in the U.S. Then you got Generation 3 and Generation 3 plus. Hi, baby girl. My baby decided to come and visit. Generation 3 and Generation 3 plus. These were developed in the 1990s, really to present. And what constitutes really a Generation 3 and 3 plus is the advancement of the safety systems, so evolutionary safety. And so these utilize passive safety systems, so gravity-fed cooling. They have modular construction, longer life, better fuel efficiency, waste reduction, and operational and these are operational and also under construction as of right now. And so, I wanted to bring that up, particularly when it comes to, hi baby, when it comes to the passive safety systems here. It's not just gravity fed cooling. There's a whole lot more that you can learn about that, and check that out in your own time. 2000s to present, these Generation 4 reactors. So these are the new advanced reactors. And these are really revolutionary. And yeah, Daddy's doing this video real quick. Revolutionary. Yeah, can you head out there, baby girl? Can you head out there? Thanks. You're going to be famous. These are revolutionary and advanced concepts. What makes them advanced is breakthroughs in safety. It uses fast neutrons and and alternative coolants. It can breed fuel and consume waste. It's proliferation resistant, technologies, and these are in the research and development and pilot phases as of right now. So, there you go. Generation 1 through 4. You can do some more research. Hey, baby girl. Hey, can you head out there for me so I can do this? Hey, thanks. No. Head out there. Head out there. Thank you. All right. Uh, let's see. Let's keep on going on. Modular and micro reactors. So these are some of the newer reactors that are being developed today. And again, they're new from the standpoint that the technology is really kind of taken off again. But they're not so new in that the technology has been around for a long time. You might think of a micro reactor. I mean, we have, again, reactors in nuclear submarines. They're small. So the technology has been around. When we're talking about advanced reactor sizes, and again, this is for commercial energy, though, is what we're talking about. Microreactors, they can generate anywhere from 1 megawatt to 20 megawatts. They can fit in a flatbed truck. These are mobile and deployable. It's dispatchable energy, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. Small modular reactors, they're a little bit bigger. They're about the size of a cargo container. They range anywhere from 20 megawatts to 300 megawatts. They can be scaled up or down by adding more units. So in other words, it's almost kind of like, in a computer, sometimes you have extra spots for RAM, and you can increase your computer's RAM by putting in, these chips. It's kind of like that with these small modular reactors and even micro reactors, as you can connect a bunch of them together to produce a whole lot more electricity. And then, of course, you got today what we commonly know, these full-size reactors, 300 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts plus, and this is what provides a lot of the baseload power today. Generation 4 advanced reactors. One of the things when we were in Idaho National Labs, the question came up, or it was at some point in the presentation, is what makes these things advanced? What is it? And really what makes it advanced is their safety features. That's what makes Generation 4 advanced reactors advanced. And we actually have a definition, which is pretty neat, even in our state statutes, which I think we might see a little bit later on. But these advanced reactor features, they're walk-away, they're walk-away safe. In other words, if all sorts of crap hits the fan and there's no one around to monitor a reactor, it actually shuts itself down. It's passively safe. It's walk-away safe. And I'd encourage you to do some more research. It's incredible, the features and the physics behind, and the engineering that goes into these advanced reactors. It's really incredible. They're very versatile. They can provide heat energy for industrial processes. They can provide for water desalinization, and load following to support intermittent power sources. So really, really versatile. Waste and reuse disposable. Again, I mentioned that a moment ago. When you can actually use nuclear waste where it's no longer a liability, but it's actually an asset. It's something that you can use. And a big part of it is the financeability of this. When we're talking about these micro or modular reactors, one of the problems today with nuclear energy is you know, it is so expensive to build a new nuclear power plant. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, including overregulation. But it takes years to develop one of these things, and it just takes too much money. Um, so what would happen if you could, miniaturize these reactors and that you could produce them on an assembly line? You remember, old Ford and his Model T and how that really revolutionized the automobile industry, where he had these assembly lines that were cranking out cars, right? And we still have that going on today. Well, what if you had that same kind of concept, only it was used for nuclear reactors? Not that scalability factor to where you can produce a lot of these, on an assembly line. That reduces the cost significantly. And that's really one of the appeals as far as the future. And I think why other governments are taking a look at this is because you can get cheap, reliable energy. There's a reason that private industry is moving in this direction. Um, there's also the federal government, and we'll talk about that. But the economics of this makes sense, particularly when you think about the scalability factor. All right, that's enough about those reactors. You kind of get the idea there. And again, the reason I'm going through this entire cycle is really to kind of give a baseline of information for folks to know, you know, what when people talk about the nuclear industry, they have an intelligent idea of, okay, I know what these people are talking about, and so this is the kind of stuff that's helped me. After um, after the fuel is spent up, which today I think takes around 24 months. It's like 18 to 24 months is how much fuel lasts. And some of these advanced reactors, you're talking like 5 to 10 years without refueling. But that spent fuel and waste has to go somewhere. And that's where we talk about fuel, spent fuel storage. And what happens currently with our 90 some uh, commercial power reactors in the United States is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission mandates that spent fuel has to be stored on site. And it's stored on site in something called casks. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And it is required to stay on that site until such a time that the federal government comes and takes ownership or possession of that for permanent disposal or for some kind of other interim storage. Um, Back in late July, there was a minerals committee meeting in Casper, and the head honcho over nuclear waste and storage at the Department of Energy, his name is Paul Murray, and he gave this presentation, and it's really phenomenal. In fact, what I'll do is I'll try to provide those links to those videos so you can check it out in the description box. And his presentation is about an hour long, but he talks about in particular waste and the federal government's responsibility, what the federal government has done, what the federal government is doing currently, in particular with, military cleanup. You've got the commercialization part of the nuclear, the nuclear industry, but you also have the weaponization part that the federal government was involved in, which has created its own messes. And so the Department of Energy has to clean all that up. So he talks about what they're doing now, those cleanup efforts, and also what they're going to do in the future. And I'll mention a little bit that more a little bit later on. But all of that to say, um, nuclear waste is the federal government's problem. They have made it their problem. They are the ones who have to take possession, ownership of that, and so the nuclear waste must stay on site until the federal government comes and picks it up. One of the problems is there isn't a permanent disposal site for it. Yucca Mountain was supposed to be the permanent disposal site, the permanent repository, but then that fell through, and so there's no site. And so one of the problems for the U.S. government is they need to come up with a permanent solution. And part of President Trump's executive orders is directing the Department of Energy to come up with a plan and to execute that plan. So let's talk a little bit about industrial waste, nuclear waste. First of all, nuclear waste is an industrial waste product. And I wanted to point this out. Every industrial process involves wastes and byproducts, some of them which are very hazardous and toxic. And this isn't true just for the nuclear industry. It's true for the coal industry. It's true for the oil industry. It's true for other, petrochemical plants and whatnot, or other chemical plants. It's true for, manufacturers that create plastics and things like that. Industrial processes have industrial waste. And of course, being the good people that we are here in America, we care about the safety of people. We care about our environment. And so our federal government in the late 1960s, I believe it was, created, one of the things they created was the EPA, the Environmental Protection Act. And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, uses the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA framework, to identify the type, source, and characteristics of waste so that it can be properly managed, tackled, and disposed of for cradle to grave accountability. This isn't just true of the nuclear industry, it is true of every industry that produces some kind of waste. And there are some industrial wastes that persist for a millennia, for thousands of years. Now, nuclear waste is one of those. If it's not put in a fast reactor and those high radioactive nucleotides with long half-lives, if they aren't burned up, then it's going to last a really, really, really long time. But that's not the only one that humanity has to worry about. So radioactive waste certainly is one, and that comes again from nuclear power plants, weapons production, even nuclear medicine. But there are also things like heavy metals and metallurgical slags. So this is a result of things like mining, smelting, electronics, batteries. When we think of mining operations or even burning coal, you have these heavy metals that are toxic to people, like mercury, that you have to do something about. You can't let it go unaddressed because they're dangerous to the public. So you have to mitigate those risks. You have to mitigate those dangers. Some people say, well, why do we even expose ourselves to these risks if all of this stuff is so dangerous? Well, there's a couple things. Number one, we have the technology to mitigate those risks, but number two, the benefits far outweigh the risks, and especially when you can mitigate those risks. Having electricity is a really, 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 really good thing versus not having electricity. And so even though, whether it's burning coal or nuclear waste or whatever, even though you might have some kind of industrial waste as a byproduct, if you can mitigate that risk so that people in the environment are taken care of, you make the benefit even worth it all the more. There are toxic industrial chemicals. These are used in manufacturing. They're lethal in small doses. So these are things like chlorine gas, benzene, which is used in petrochemicals, gasoline and things like that. Dangerous stuff. There's persistent organic pollutants. These are things like pesticides, industrial chemicals, flame retardants. These things last hundreds of thousands of years. That's part of the thing with pesticides. that the pesticide industry in particular has come under scrutiny for is, you're spraying these chemicals, and these chemicals stay in the soils, and they don't go away, they don't degrade, and they last, for millennia. And what kind of health or adverse effects is that having on the environment, on wildlife, and on people? You've got these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. Um, most people don't know what that is, including myself. But we do understand nonstick cookware, right? So nonstick cookware, this is that coating that goes on there. And it's not to say that this coating is necessarily toxic, though it could be. Um, it is to say that the stuff doesn't degrade. It lasts. It you can't get rid of it. It doesn't decay. And so it persists for a long, long, long time, millions, or not millions of years, thousands of years. Maybe it is millions of years. I don't know. I do know it's thousands of years. Asbestos, which has been used in construction, insulation, and brake pads. Of course, we've made a point to get rid of that stuff because it causes cancer. And then synthetic polymers. So these are certain plastics, like packaging, textiles, industrial components. And again, it isn't to necessarily say that these synthetic polymers are necessarily toxic. Many of them aren't, but many of them don't break down. And so we put this stuff in our landfills, and you've all heard the same things. The stuff, these plastics that are in our landfills they're gonna last thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years before they actually break down. So those are all things that we have to mitigate. Those are all things that we have to take care of. Those are all risks that need to be managed. When it comes to nuclear waste, there's different categories of waste. There's low-level waste. And so this would include things like tools, clothing, filters, medical waste, PPE, personal protective equipment. Low-level waste actually comes from, uranium mill tailings, right? So when we do uranium mining in Campbell County, we have low-level waste that comes as a result of that through these types of things. And that low-level waste contains radium and thorium, and you can't just throw it away in a regular landfill. It has to be disposed of properly. And so we have low-level waste facilities. Actually, here in Wyoming, we store low-level waste. There's also, I think we have temporary storage here. I'm not sure if we have permanent storage here. But you have to do something with it. You can't just stick it into a landfill. There's mixed waste, which contains radioactive and hazardous chemical components. So these are things that meet both the RCRA and the NRC standards, right? So, it's a mixed bag, so to speak. You've got transuranic waste. Again, these are elements that are heavier than uranium, that are produced as a result of nuclear reactions. Whether it's for commercial energy or it's for America's weaponization program. And so these are things like neptunium and americium. And interesting here is, we do store these in a deep geologic repository. Many people think, well, America doesn't have a deep geologic repository. Actually, we do. It's called the WIPP facility. It's the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's in New Mexico, and currently it houses only these transuranic wastes. And then there is high-level waste, which is spent nuclear fuel from reactors and waste from fuel reprocessing. And these contain long-lived radionucleotides like plutonium and cesium-137. And I'll give you an indication here. Actually, that'll come up in here in the next slide. We'll talk more about some of those radionucleotides. When we're talking about nuclear waste, on the left here is enriched uranium fuel. Now remember, the fuel that's in today's reactors is enriched anywhere from 3 to 5%. This chart here shows uranium-235 being enriched to 3%. 97% of that on here it shows as uranium-238, and this is the type of thing that goes into a fuel rod. It goes into it's what constitutes a reactor core. It goes into a reactor. After it gets used, after it gets spent, what you have is you have the same amount of material, but it's transformed. And so what you end up getting is 95% of it is uranium-238. So it lost a couple of percent of the uranium-238. You got 1% of the uranium-235 left. 1% has turned into plutonium. And then you have 3% of these fission products. And these fission products are the high-level radioactive waste. Now, I wanted to show you this because when we're talking about spent fuel and waste, sometimes people just call it spent fuel. Sometimes people just call it waste. They're actually two different things. They're a little bit nuanced. Of the spent fuel, 97% of this material, the uranium and the plutonium, it's all reusable material. This is the stuff that can be recycled. This 3% here, as it's shown on the chart, are these fission products, this high level radioactive waste, and that is the stuff that is, that's the stuff that you have to bury, you have to get rid of if it's not, burned up in a fast reactor. As far as some of these fission products and radionucleotides, you can kind of get a sense here of the half-life. You have kind of these short-lived fission products. You have medium-lived, they call them actinides, like plutonium-240, and then these long-lived actinides. So plutonium-239, as you can see there, half-life is 24,000 years. That's a long time to wait for something to decay. But again, if this plutonium can be used in a fast reactor and it can be burned up, you solve your problem there. So it's pretty incredible. What does it say here? The first century sees a rapid drop in activity thanks to cesium-137 and strontium-90. Beyond that, the decay curve is governed by plutonium isotopes with half-lives of thousands of years. And again, if you can use that plutonium, well, then you've actually made something that's going to last, hundreds of thousands of years, and maybe you need to put it in the ground for only 300 years. Here it is. This is what the other thing that I wanted you to see. These are some of the fission products. So of that 3% that we looked at in the chart earlier, these are some of those fission products and radionucleotides, and it's all sorts of different things. And again, these are all radioactive, nasty little buggers, right? These are the things that you don't want to be around. So cesium-137, as you can see here, has a half-life of 30 years. And a lot of these you'll notice here are relatively short. I think 30 years is kind of, that's a more of a mid-range. But then you have something like this technetium, I think is how you pronounce that, 99. 211,000 years for something like that to decay. Again, if it's not put in the fast reactor, the stuff that comes out of our light water reactors, this is a long time. Most of this stuff, you'll notice here, within 30 years or so, most of that material has come down to a safe level. But then you have these outliers, some of these like the technetium, that live a long time. So again, those fast reactors and the ability to burn up some of these radionucleotides is really promising as far as a solution to getting rid of some of that waste. What do we do with the waste right now? Well, it's stored on site. The spent fuel and waste, and it's stored in casks. And you can see kind of a picture here. The picture on the right is actual casks. Well, you see those guys are standing right next to it. Aren't they going to get bombarded with radiation? And the answer is no. These things are highly safe. They're built to be safe, so that you can stand right next to it. And there's a lot of high regulations. In fact, part of the regulation from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is that you would receive more background information from the natural environment than you would standing next to one of these, or a nuclear power plant. That's kind of how robust those regulations are. A dry cask, the structure of a dry cask, it is It is essentially a metal and concrete container within which is the nuclear core, that fissile material. And you almost might think of it as for those of you who are familiar with Russian nesting dolls, you kind of have these layers, and that's kind of what you have here. And so you can kind of see a picture there. Um, after it comes out of a reactor, it's still very hot, like thermally hot, and so it's put into a cooling pool. Of course, it's also radioactive. It's shooting off radioactive material, and so it's put underwater in these cooling pools. That does two things. Number one, the water it actually shields people from radiation, so you could actually go into a facility and you wouldn't be hurt by the radiation because it's underwater. So it's stopping the radiation. But it also helps to cool the material because there's still, even though it's no longer in the reactor, there's still some chain reaction going on, and it just takes time for that chain reaction to slow and for that material to cool. After it is cooled, they put it in these dry casks. So they put it in these concrete casks. I believe they do that underwater, and then they take the water out, and then they fill the rest of the container with an inert gas. And then they have monitoring systems to ensure that there's no leakage of radiation. And that's where the material sits, and it sits there until it's finally picked up by the federal government. Now there are some waste that is actually transported in the United States. Um, so for instance, you have our Navy, and that waste has to go somewhere. It just can't stay in the ocean. It can't stay, inside of a nuclear submarine or an aircraft carrier. And so that waste, of course, is then they bring those Navy vessels here. The old waste is taken out. There's new material, if that vessel is going to continue to keep going, that's put in. Um, that old waste is put into casks, and those casks then are for the U.S. military, they are shipped to disposal sites. And this is one of those things that you can hear about in Paul Murray's presentation at the Minerals Committee. Is there is actually we ship nuclear material over public rail and our public highways all of the time. It is a common thing. Um, and there hasn't been any accidents or anything like that. Part of it is because these shipping casks are so robust. You can actually YouTube these videos showing how they test these transport casks, where they're like hitting it with trains. They're lighting it on fire with jet fuel. They're slamming into it with a semi going 80 miles an hour. Like they put these casks through the ringer to make sure that no matter what happens to it, um, that they're going to hold up, and they do. And in all of the years that we've had these casks since we've been doing this, which I think is about 40 years or so, there hasn't been one cask failure. So it's pretty robust technology. So some of that anyway is it's transported. Where is it transported? Um, there's a lot of it. It's actually transported to Idaho National Labs. When we were there, we actually got to go to the site where they were storing this material. We were there. We got to see it, with our own eyes. Um, and we were on a tour bus. They wouldn't let us off the tour bus. I think for security reasons. There was a security card there, and he wasn't too happy about us being there anyway. um but he, it was kind of interesting. He was parked right outside. The bus drove right next to these casks. He got out of his truck. Obviously he's not worried about getting radiation and all that, because of course all these things are monitored and whatnot, and the radiation exposure just isn't there. Um, all that to say, uh, this material comes from our nuclear fleet, and a lot of it is transported, like I said, through rail and public highway through Wyoming. So we actually have a lot of the stuff that already travels through Wyoming,
on its way to Idaho National Labs. Finally, there's the well, not finally. There's the reprocessing part of this, and this is something that we currently don't have. America used to do this. Like I mentioned earlier, we stopped doing this during the Carter administration. The country of France, it still recycles spent fuel. Recycled fuel contains both uranium and plutonium, and this mix is called a mixed oxide or MOX. So you remember the earlier chart that kind of showed you of the enriched uranium, how it goes into a reactor and how it comes out and how the percentages change. This one is a little bit different because this is I think based upon 5% enriched uranium. But essentially through that process, 95% of it is uranium 238, 1% is mostly uranium plutonium 239, although it's not all plutonium 239. There's other isotopes, and the uranium and plutonium together can be reused and used in mixed oxide fuel. You can actually enrich the uranium again if you wanted to do that. Um, and that's what France does. What you're left with is 4% of this is the highly radioactive, non-reusable waste. Those are those fission products. And again, that's how it is currently right now in fast reactors, and that's the promise of that fast reactor technology is that percentage might even be less. And of the percentage that remains, instead of hundreds of thousands of years waiting for something to decay, and with a half life, it actually might only be 300. So roughly 96% of spent fuel is recoverable and it is reusable. And so it's pretty incredible. And it's pretty incredible that we don't do this. Again, part of that is politics. Part of it is also the expense. Um, with advancements in technology, though, I do think that it's something that um, I do think it's something that is probably more economical today. But that remains to be seen, and we're gonna I guess see with the direction of the Trump administration. Finally, there's of the waste that remains, and no matter what, whether you recycle this stuff and reprocess it or not, you're still going to have high level waste that needs to be stored. And scientists have said that the best way to store this is in a a waste storage facility, a deep underground repository somewhere far, far away from society. And by the way, as we've talked about all this, it goes without saying, this is solidified waste. This isn't liquid. It's not a gas. It's this is solid waste. So it doesn't like spill out and ooze out and leak out or anything like that. That's not how it works. The question I've heard someone ask the question: why don't we blast this nuclear waste? Why don't we blast it into outer space? And I'm sure a lot of people have thought of that. And there's two really good reasons why we don't blast it off into outer space. Number one is, again, 96% of nuclear spent fuel and waste is reusable and recoverable. Rather than being a liability, it's an asset. It's actually worth something. It would be like, getting rid of some kind of treasure, if you will. So that's one reason that we don't blast it out in the outer space, because if we blast it out in the outer space, well, it ain't ever coming back. We're not going to recover it. The second thing is more practical, and that really is, you know, if a rocket blows up or goes up into the atmosphere and blows up with all of this nuclear material in it, um, well, now you have radioactive material raining down on huge, huge swaths of territory, right? And so you've just made your problem a whole lot worse. And so Those are the reasons we don't blast it out into outer space. Those are the reasons I've been told anyway. We do have a deep underground repository currently, but it's not used for high level waste. It is used for transuranic waste, which is these transuranic nucleotides that have been separated from high level waste. You're able to separate those out, and a lot of this comes from our military, from our weaponization program. This is called the WIP facility. I mentioned it earlier. And it's America's only deep geologic repository. It actually is being used. It's about 3,000 feet underground, and it lies within a giant salt layer. And really, the goal over time is eventually they'll abandon this facility, and the salt will collapse in on all of this waste that is buried in there. There are other countries like Sweden and Norway that do have, or they're building, deep underground geologic repositories. President Trump has directed his Department of Energy to come up with a solution which would involve, more than likely, another deep geologic repository, and or maybe utilizing this one. I have wondered and pondered myself if this facility couldn't also, it could be expanded, and you could just continue to put not only transuranic waste, but why not put high level waste down there too? After all, you already have the infrastructure there, and you have the ability and the technology to expand this, and dig out more, these more panels, as you can see there. So anyway, that's a little bit about that long-term storage. That would be the future home, anyway, of long-term waste, which, like I said, currently doesn't exist in America except for this WIP facility. All right. That was it for the nuclear fuel cycle. That took a long time. I have no idea where we're at in time. That's okay. I'm just going to keep on going on. I'm going to address the next question here. And that is, why is all of this nuclear talk happening? And as you can see through the presentation thus far, part of it is advancement in technology. There's been advancements in materials engineering, advancements in reactor designs, advancements in safety features, advancement in waste mitigation. So all of these things, the industry doesn't stay the same. Think of the coal industry and coal power plants. It used to be that coal ash would actually rain from the sky. Doesn't do that anymore. Why? Because technology has evolved, technology has advanced. So that's one of the reasons that some of this nuclear talk is happening. Another reason is previous nuclear developments in our region and in our state. So, for example, we have uranium mining in Campbell County. There's a natural nexus to the nuclear industry as far as some kind of some kind of increased business activity around this industry. We have Idaho National Laboratory, which is in our region as far as kind of our neighborhood, which has really been a key location, a key player in the nuclear industry. And so being in proximity to that, our neighbors there in Idaho. Again, this is some of the reason why some of this nuclear talk is happening here. Part of it is just our proximity to Idaho, and just being in this region. Another reason is TerraPower's Natrium plant. So back in the early 2000s, not early 2000s, I'm sorry, early 2020s, I guess maybe 5 years ago, I guess I could have said, there was some legislators who were trying to increase, from what I understand, I heard this at the Minerals Committee, who were reaching out to different industries, including the nuclear industry, saying, hey, why don't you look at Wyoming as a potential place to do business? and they got the attention of TerraPower. And the long and short of it is TerraPower is building their Natrium plant in Kemmerer. And as a result of some of these, some of these developments, I guess you could say other nuclear oriented companies are looking at Wyoming as a potential place to do business. Again, kind of all of these things together is part of the reason why all of this nuclear talk is happening. But there's another reason, and that is President Trump's executive orders. I'm going to go through these kind of one by one, and then I'm going to actually pull up some of these fact sheets on these executive orders so that I think by seeing them, you will get a really good indication of why why there is all of this nuclear talk all of a sudden in Wyoming and also in Campbell County. So President Trump issued four executive orders in particular to nuclear. You might say a fifth one. We'll talk about that in a second, but I'm going to talk about these four. The first is reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base. The second is deploying advanced nuclear reactor technologies for national security. The third is streamline nuclear reactor testing at the Department of Energy. And the fourth is the reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'm going to pull up this other screen, and we're going to look at some of these. The other one that I mentioned, or I didn't mention, that kind of goes along. I think it was released at the same time as these nuclear executive orders, which I think was back in May or June of this year. There's also one on restoring gold standard science in America, and kind of the long and short of that is President Trump believes that our science testing was more wishy-washy, and so he wants to beef it up. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I am going to talk about these others. So Trump reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base. So I have some things highlighted here. I just want to go through so that you can get a sense of what President Trump is wanting to do with this industry and with America. This executive order is to expedite and promote the production and operation of nuclear energy. He puts which is necessary to power the next generation technologies that secure our global industrial, digital, and economic dominance, achieve energy independence, and protect our national security. This executive order in particular, it recommends a national policy to support spent fuel. So the spent fuel management, evaluation of policies regarding commercial recycling and reprocessing of nuclear fuels, and recommendations for the efficient use of nuclear waste materials. In other words, President Trump, I believe he put a 240-day, window, and he said, Department of Energy, within 240 days, you need to come up with a plan that not only addresses nuclear waste, but also starts the process when it comes to recycling and reprocessing of nuclear fuels. The executive order goes on to expand domestic uranium conversion capacity and enrichment capabilities to meet projected civilian and defense reactor needs. As you're going to see a little bit later on, and he writes about this, the industry is severely atrophied, and as we were talking through that nuclear cycle, we don't have the conversion capacity, and we don't have the enrichment capabilities that we need. And so President Trump says we need to beef that up, and that's exactly what is happening. He goes on. This executive order is to seek voluntary agreements with domestic nuclear energy companies for the procurement of enriched uranium and for consultation regarding methods to enhance domestic capability to manage spent nuclear fuel, to support the establishment of nuclear industry consortia by ensuring offtake for newly established domestic fuel supply across milling, conversion, deconversion, enrichment, fabrication, and recycling and reprocessing. In other words, what he's saying here is, not only does he want the private industry to get involved in more enrichment and conversion and the capacity there. But he's saying that the federal government is going to be a customer. We're going to make sure that this industry succeeds by making sure that there is some offtake until we see more involvement from the private industry. He goes on and he wants to construct 10 new large reactors by 2030. There are federal loans and loan guarantees will be prioritized to support increased nuclear energy, including restarting closed nuclear power plants and completing construction of prematurely suspended plants. And I guess we should go back and ask the question: why are we doing all of this? And part of it is because we need energy. We don't have enough of it, and you're going to see that in one of these executive orders as well. Then it goes on in prioritizing funding for companies with potential for near-term deployment of advanced nuclear technologies. So essentially, what President Trump is doing is he is not only taking the boot of government off of the neck of the industry by means of the excessive regulation that has been stifling it for many, 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 many years. He is throwing the full support and weight of the federal government behind this industry to see it succeed. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what's happening. I'm not saying any of us has to like that. And in fact, I don't necessarily like when the government gets behind any industry. That seems more like picking in winners and losers. Be that as it may, this is the reality that we're facing here in 2025. Part of this is expanding American nuclear workforce. I want to mention some of these. Nuclear engineering and nuclear energy related careers will be considered priority areas for actions. Increased participation in nuclear energy related registered apprenticeships, and career and technical education programs. What does this mean? Well, this means this is probably something that our community colleges in particular, but also our universities are going to see more area of interest and focus because the federal government wants to see this industry succeed. Increase access to research and development infrastructure, workforce, and expertise at the Department of Energy National Laboratories for college and university nuclear engineering students. So more opportunity to learn more about this industry. Strengthening the domestic nuclear fuel supply chain. This is the whole point of this is to enable long-term expansion of nuclear energy, to maximize the value of nuclear fuel and expand the domestic nuclear fuel supply chain. And so this is where I think some of this begins to make sense. He says the nation's nuclear fuel cycle infrastructure has severely atrophied, with domestic fuel sources supplying only 5% of the fuel used in U.S. reactors. In addition to permitting challenges in mining the relevant minerals, in 1977, the federal government introduced a policy that did not allow reprocessing of used fuel for commercial reactors, leaving the United States heavily dependent on foreign sources of uranium, as well as uranium enrichment and conversion services. In other words, thank you, Jimmy Carter, for that. That was under his watch. Essentially, we have given more control of our nuclear industry to foreign bodies, foreign entities, foreign countries, and that just isn't acceptable to President Trump. And so he wants to advance mining activities relevant to these minerals pursuant to his executive order. Immediate measures to increase domestic mineral production. What does that mean? It's going to mean more mining, if anything, here in Campbell County. And to ensure that we can not only mine, but also process, refine nuclear fuel domestically. So beefing up this entire supply chain. So bringing this kind of to a county level, when BWXT was looking at developing things potentially in Campbell County, again, no decisions have been made. The timeline they gave us was still, we were looking maybe around 2030 before, anything was, substantially was going to happen. But as a result of these executive orders, that has put this industry into kind of overdrive to where the timelines of everything have escalated, or ramped up considerably. Let's look at another one. Again, like I said, there's 4 of these things. All right. This one is deploying nuclear reactors for national security. And this is to rapidly deploy advanced nuclear technologies to support national security objectives, including powering artificial intelligence, computing infrastructure, and national security installations. Some of the highlights here of supporting nuclear partnerships with the private sector. He's ordering the Secretary of Energy to release at least 20 metric tons of high-assay, low-enriched uranium into a readily available fuel bank for the private sector projects operating nuclear reactors to power AI infrastructure and DOE sites. Now, this is important for a particular reason. 20 metric tons of HALEU, up to 20% enriched. And the reason that this is important is because, you have a company like BWXT. You kind of have this chicken and an egg problem right now. These newer reactors are going to use TRISO fuel, but the TRISO fuel is not really being developed right now, nor is the reactors really available to use it, nor is there enough domestic material, uranium, U-235 enriched. There's not enough of it to even make into TRISO. So essentially what the federal government is doing here is saying, hey, we're going to take 20 metric tons of enriched uranium, of this HALEU enriched uranium, for a company, say like BWXT, to then take that material and then fabricate that into a TRISO fuel, because it's not available right now because we don't have the supply chains in America to provide that. You can see how atrophied the nuclear industry has been. The Secretary of Energy and Defense shall utilize their authorities to enable the construction and operation of privately funded nuclear fuel recycling, reprocessing, and fabrication capabilities at federal sites. It directs the Secretaries of Energy and Defense to explore using categorical exclusions under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, for construction of advanced nuclear reactor technologies on federal sites. In other words, what is he doing? He's cutting through regulation. That's what he's wanting to do. It orders, this is promoting American nuclear exports. Again, we're importing a lot of this right now, not exporting it. The order directs the Secretary of State to implement a program to enhance the global competitiveness of American nuclear companies by expediting agreements and removing burdens on American exports. In other words, let's cut through the red tape so that America's businesses can do business with other countries. Powering critical infrastructure and national security systems, military installations, including those in locations that are not well served by other types of power due to complex supply chains required to reach them, require uninterruptible, dispatchable, high-density power of the type that advanced nuclear reactors can provide because of their unique size and generation capabilities. This is critical for readiness and national security. In other words, when we go back to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, you had bases that were all of a sudden made up in the desert, and you have to have power from somewhere. Where did that power come from? Well, it came from diesel power generation. Unfortunately, a lot of the deaths that occurred in those conflicts came as a result of moving fuel. You constantly need more fuel, more diesel to come in so that you can power the base. You got to have that. Well, what if you could take a microreactor that is it can be shipped anywhere, and instead of a diesel generator, you have a microreactor that can power up to 5 megawatts, which would, by the way, that would power all of Campbell County. So you have this microreactor that's dispatchable. It's mobile, um, and it doesn't need to be refueled for 5 to 10 years, right? That's really kind of the military edge I think that President Trump is looking at, and how these not only are these very not only is this technology could it be utilized for things like the energy needs of AI, but for national security purposes for our military. I mean, we already use micro reactors in a sense in Navy vessels. Well, why aren't we doing the same thing on land? Um, that's the idea. He goes on by empowering the Department of Energy and Department of Defense to expand utilization of advanced nuclear power, and instructing each to reduce regulatory red tape hampering use of nuclear power at their sites. This order enhances our national security and reduces reliance on foreign sources of energy for our military and AI operations. 87% of new reactor builds worldwide are based on foreign designs, and the majority of the world's nuclear fuel comes from foreign sources. By instructing the Department of State and other agencies to aggressively pursue export opportunities, this order will strengthen our relationships with allies and disrupt potential industry control by adversaries. In other words, America has fallen way, way, way behind, and that is not acceptable to our president. He thinks that America should be a leader in the nuclear energy space. Um, and really, the thought is America builds great products, and if the world is going to have these kind of products, then they should be American made. And if other if there's going to be other countries who are going to buy advanced nuclear reactors, then they should be American nuclear reactors, because we do a good job at building these things. Unleashing America's energy will create jobs, economic prosperity, increase the United States trade balance, help our country compete with hostile foreign powers, strengthen relations with allies and partners, and support international peace security. Two more. This one streamlines the nuclear reactor testing at the Department of Energy. So this is to reform and streamline the national laboratory processes for reactor testing at the DOE. So at the Idaho National Laboratory, they are taking an existing containment dome that had a nuclear reactor inside of it, and they are converting that now to be a testing site, a testing pad for these micro nuclear reactors, is what they're doing. The order finds that the design, construction, and operation of advanced reactors under sufficient DOE control are, for the time being, for research purposes and thus fall within DOE jurisdiction, issuing guidance on what counts as qualified test reactor, taking steps to expeditiously process applications for such reactors, enable operation test reactors within 2 years following the completed application. So in other words, they're not wasting any time. They want these new reactors to be tested, in no time at all. Creating a pilot program for the construction and operation of at least 3 reactors outside of the national laboratories, but under contract with and for the account of DOE, with the goal of achieving criticality by July 4th, 2026. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one of these 3 is the Natrium reactor in Kemmerer, Wyoming. Fostering nuclear innovation. President Trump is committed to establishing the United States as a global leader in nuclear energy and securing reliable, diversified, and affordable energy supply to drive American prosperity and technological advancement. While the United States has led development of civilian nuclear power through the Atomic Energy Commission, The National Reactor Testing Station, now Idaho National Laboratory, and other federal entities, the commercial deployment of new nuclear technologies has all but stopped in recent decades. And that really is kind of a shame. Overregulation by the federal government has stifled the domestic development and deployment of advanced reactors. Regulation is a good thing. Too much regulation is a bad thing. While the United States cultivated the effort to design and build the first generation 4 reactor for commercial use, we have since ceded the initiative to foreign nations in building these advanced reactors. Advanced reactors have revolutionary potential, opening a range of new applications to support data centers, microchip manufacturing, petrochemical production, healthcare, desalination of water, hydrogen production, and other industries. This order ensures that America's innovators have clear pathways to create nuclear technologies that will propel economic prosperity and bolster national security. In a nutshell, what is President Trump doing? He's wanting to get government out of the way and actually have government be a help for a change, particularly when it comes to this technology. Again, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I mean, I do kind of think it's a good thing that government gets out of the way of the industry. I don't really like when the government then gets in bed with the industry. I think that's a whole nother thing completely. But this is what's happening. Last one. This one is to reform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it's to reduce our dependence on foreign technologies, which we are highly dependent on, which, again, it's a national security risk at this point. Decrease regulatory barriers, and supply our domestic nuclear energy. Within 18 months, to comprehensively revise its regulations and guideline documents with a focus on balancing safety concerns with the benefits of nuclear energy for our economy and national security. In other words, President Trump isn't trying to get rid of, make things less safe. I think some people might come to that conclusion. That's not it at all. The fact of the matter is the NRC, particularly under Biden, has been so weaponized, and the EPA for that matter, that they put such an emphasis on keeping the environment essentially untouched from mankind that it stifled any and all development, including coal mining, by the way. I'm thankful not only is Trump taking the direction that he's taking with nuclear energy, he is taking that same approach with the fossil fuels industry, including our coal industry. Getting rid of that regulation, allowing the industry to excel and to compete without undue government infringement, and not putting more of an emphasis on environmental concerns. Not that we don't care about the environment, we do, but that has to be balanced, right, with our economy and our national security. There's got to be balance. It can't be unequal, and it's been weighted towards not doing anything because it might hurt the environment. It's been weighted in that direction for way too long. So this order establishes fixed guidelines, fixed deadlines, for evaluation and approval of licenses, which is a good thing. Fixed deadlines instead of wishy-washy deadlines. It really stinks if you're dealing with an agency like the EPA or whatever, or the NRC, and there's these wishy-washy deadlines to where they're always moving the goalpost on you. I mean, how does that help industry? It doesn't. Fixed deadlines are a good thing. Adopting science-based radiation limits instead of relying on flawed radiation exposure models. Again, this goes back to the previous, the gold standard in science. Let's actually have our decisions be based on science. So what is a science-based radiation limit? Revising regulations governing compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. So in other words, let's make sure that our regulations are in compliance with existing law, including NEPA. NEPA is not a bad thing. It can be a bad thing when it was used like the Obama administration and it was totally weaponized against industry. establishing an expedited pathway for improving reactor designs that have been safely tested by the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, establishing a process for high volume licensing of microreactors and modular reactors, and then reconsidering regulations limiting license terms. In other words, what is he doing? He's, as he said, it's streamlining, it's trying to right size these regulations to make sure that these regulations do, in fact, work to protect people and the environment, but that they're not working against innovation and they're not working against the private industry. Realigning NRC culture and personnel. He wants to reform its culture and realign its organization to reflect Congress's directive to rapidly promote nuclear power while ensuring reactor safety. In other words, let's go back to what the law originally said. He's right. He's trying to right size things, and I don't fault him for that. That's a good thing. When licensing and regulating civilian nuclear power, the NRC is directed to consider the benefits of nuclear power to our economic and national security, in addition to traditional concerns regarding safety, health, and environmental factors. In other words, let's find that balance. Reforming the NRC, President Trump is committed to reestablishing the United States as a global leader in nuclear energy. We're a follower at the moment. America should be the leader, which will create tens of thousands of high-paying jobs and generate American-led prosperity and resilience. Since 1978, Carter administration, only 2 new nuclear reactors have begun construction and entered into commercial operation. Meanwhile, in just a single day, President Trump is signing twice as many executive orders to start a nuclear renaissance in the United States. Oh no, hey baby. It's okay. Oh no, is he being mean? I've been in here way too long. This video's gone on and on. Thanks for hanging with me. All right, I'll be out there in a second. Can you go? I'm almost finished here. Okay, can you be quiet? Shh, be quiet. Due to an overly risk-adverse culture that requires, for example, nuclear facilities to emit as little radiation as possible, including below naturally occurring levels, the NRC has failed to license new reactors even as technology advances promise to make nuclear power safer, cheaper, and more adaptable and more abundant than ever. The order establishes that U.S. policy will seek to facilitate the increased deployment of new nuclear reactor technologies and expand American nuclear energy capacity around 100 gigawatts today to 400 gigawatts by 2050. So that is quite the increase. So again, I mentioned all of that because again, why is all of this nuclear talk happening? You can see not only the advancement in technology and some of the happenings in Wyoming, but also the executive orders of President Trump has sent this industry into overdrive, essentially. And that's a lot of why we're getting the interest we are in Wyoming. What's happening around the state? I mentioned TerraPower's Nature project in Kemmerer, Wyoming. In fact, that's a picture of it. The reactor, the microreactor, is actually embedded underground. There's a waste. The cooling pool is kind of over on the right. There's Radiant in Bar None, Wyoming. Radiant is wanting to manufacture microreactors. In fact, I had mentioned Idaho National Labs and the dome that they are essentially retrofitting to test microreactors. Radiant's microreactor is going to be the first one that's tested in that dome. And that's going to happen this July, this next coming July, I believe. And what they're wanting to do is to build a factory. Now, their business model is a little bit different in that, they're going to build these microreactors, which can be sent all over the place, but they need to be brought back to the facility after 5 to 10 years to be refueled. And their business model as it stands right now is to take out the old fuel, put new fuel in, and then send the unit back out. and they want to keep the fuel on site and bar none. Currently, state laws we're going to get into in a moment, state law does not allow would not allow bar none to do that. They could still bring reactors into the state. They could swap out the fuel. But if it, under state law as it is today, they would need to ship that waste somewhere else. They couldn't keep it on site. BWXT, I mentioned earlier, they're also involved in some things, I think, in Sweetwater County and the Trona Patch. And I think what they're wanting to do there is perhaps put some micro reactors in the Trona Patch. I don't know exactly all those partnerships, but those are some of the things that are happening actually in Wyoming. And so that brings us to Campbell County. Uh, what's happening in Campbell County? Well, obviously, there's uranium mining. And probably no matter what, we're going to see a whole lot more of uranium mining. I mentioned BWXT, and BWXT is looking at Campbell County as a potential location for a new TRISO fuel fabrication facility. And this is in keeping not only with the advancements that we're seeing within the industry, but also in keeping with Trump's executive orders, which has really escalated the timeline potentially of any kind of development. I want to emphasize once again, no decisions or commitments have been made at this time. And BWXT is only telling us what they want to tell us. They have no obligation to inform the county commission what they're doing. They've been in communication, which has been great. I mean, they're showing themselves to be, um, you know, key business partners, real community neighbors, which is kind of what you would expect for a company like this. BWXT has been around a long, 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 long time. The picture that you see on the screen there is their Lynchburg, Virginia facility, and so it's I mean this would be a big deal. And decisions like this don't happen quickly. Um, let me point this out, and I wanted to. It's a on here. It's not uncommon for businesses, and it doesn't have to be in the nuclear industry. Any businesses, it's not uncommon for businesses to contact and meet with local government officials. Um, about a project or something along those lines. And what are they doing? Well, they are assessing their exposure to risk. When you have a company like BWXT that's wanting to build a brand new factory from the ground up, and they're going to invest hundreds of millions, maybe even a billion or more dollars, they're going to make sure that wherever they site this facility, it's going to succeed, right? If you're putting down that kind of money, that's what you're going to do. And so these kind of things, these take years to develop. Um, and so I mentioned that from this standpoint, and I think I say it elsewhere in the presentation. In all honesty, we're really kind of at the beginning stages of all of this stuff because BWXT hasn't made any decisions. I mean, we have even if they chose Campbell County, we have no idea. I don't, where they're going to go. Are they looking at private land? I don't know. Are they looking at potential county land or city land? Those are all questions that I have, as well as everybody else, and they're the ones that are ultimately going to be making those decisions. Um, a lot of times when businesses do meet with us, and this happens more frequently than you think, many times these things never even pan out. Strange how that happens, and this could be another one. Personally, I hope it's not. I think this would be a phenomenal opportunity for Campbell County. This would not involve storing any high level waste here with this facility. So it'd be a really, really awesome thing for Campbell County to, you know, have a company like BWXT to say, hey, we wanna do business in your county, in your state. That'd be pretty cool. Um, no one, let me point this out. No one from the private industry, nor from the US government, has proposed establishing a temporary or permanent repository for nuclear waste in Wyoming. I've heard people say that like they're looking at whoever they are, they're looking at Wyoming. They want to put waste here. But no one has actually said that. No one has approached us about that. And so I do want to make that known. The proposals that we have gotten By the way, Radiant at one point was looking at Campbell County, but then they decided on Natrona County instead. But none of the proposals involve keeping waste here in Campbell County. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of that. And by the way, maybe that will change. There might be a company in the future that says, hey, we want to do this, that, or the other. And maybe the federal government says, hey, would you be interested in keeping waste? That could happen in the future, but it's not happening right now. And there's been no indication that that's going to happen. So just want to make that clear. What do our state laws say on the subject of nuclear waste anyway? You can see the statutes here. You can look these up. I do want to pull up which screen was that? Let me pull this up real quick so you can see for yourself. I thought this was interesting. So this is 3511-1501. It gives a definition of high-level radioactive waste storage facility. It includes any facility for high-level radioactive waste storage other than a permanent repository operated by a federal agency pursuant to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. The long and short of it is this. This statute right here essentially is saying that any kind of nuclear waste, whether it's temporary or permanent, is illegal in Wyoming. That is current law. And this statute in particular, with the definition as it is, it's essentially, if I can say it this way, it allows an avenue for temporary waste if the legislature gives approval. But when you're talking about like a permanent waste facility, it's just flat out illegal. In order, and again, this is something the federal government is in charge of, but if the federal government wanted to put a nuclear waste facility in Wyoming or Campbell County, let's say, the law would literally need to be changed. The House and the Senate would both need to vote and pass a bill, and it would need to go to the governor for his signature. State statute would literally need to be changed in order to keep permanent nuclear waste here in Wyoming. And in order to hold temporary waste in Wyoming, the legislature would still need to act. And let me show you that. This is in 3511-1506. Says, except as provided in subsection E of this section, no construction may commence, nor shall any high-level radioactive waste storage facility be sited within this state unless the legislature has acted legislation approving the siting, construction, and operation of the facility in accord with this section. So in other words, it's illegal in Wyoming for any kind of temporary storage or permanent storage, and the only way for that to change would be for the legislature to take positive action to enact that change. Now, it goes on and it says, except as provided in subsection E of this section. Is there a way that nuclear waste can be kept in Wyoming? And the answer is yes. And how is that? It is with the Kemmerer plant. So in other words, the NRC, under current regulations, requires any existing power plant to keep nuclear waste on site until the federal government comes and gets it. That's just NRC regulation. And the Natrium plant is the same way. So the Natrium plant is going to have to keep its own waste that it produces. It's going to have to keep it on site. And subsection E is the thing that allows for that. And it's not just, here it is, the legislature hereby authorizes the siting of temporary high-level radioactive waste storage facilities within the state subject to the following. A facility is authorized if it is operated on the site of and to store the high-level radioactive waste or spent nuclear fuel produced by the nuclear power generation facility operating within the state. So in other words, this isn't just subject to or only applies to Kemmerer. If, let's say, Black Hills Energy wanted to build a microreactor nuclear plant in Campbell County, under this statute, it could, and it would have to keep the nuclear waste on site. per this statute. Now, there's a whole lot more as far as the regulations and all that to even get to that point, mind you. But the point is yes, nuclear waste can be kept in Wyoming temporarily if it's produced here in Wyoming through a nuclear power plant that is in Wyoming, and no nuclear waste from outside of Wyoming that came from other nuclear power plants cannot be brought into the state either temporarily or permanently unless the legislature were to change the law or give authorization. So, let's go back to PowerPoint. So that's what state law says on the subject. What role does the county have? I think we're almost done. What is the role of the county? And has there been any decisions that have been made? I think part of what we see as the role of the county right now is educating and informing people. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're at the beginning of this process in Campbell County. Even the government, the local government, we are subject to the decisions of what private businesses may or may not do. The Campbell, our local government, your Campbell County Commission, does not have the authority to make a business operate or to keep a business from operating. I mean, we just don't have that authority. And by the way, you don't want to give government that kind of authority. That's the kind of authority they have in the People's Republic of China, right? Where the government picks and chooses, which businesses get to exist and which ones don't, right? It would be a pretty messed up thing if someone wanted to build a new grocery store in town, but it needed to get the government's permission. As long as it's abiding by the regulation and rules and laws that have been set out by the state, a business is free to operate. And it's no different with the nuclear industry. So for us, we're on the edge of our seats just like everybody else because we're thinking, what's going to happen? And we really don't know until these businesses make decisions. And so for us, it's okay. In light of what's coming, in light of what's brought us to this point, I think the thinking anyway, on at least for myself, and I think on the commission as well, is and with the city, is let's try to inform the public. And so that's why you're seeing more of these town halls and these educational events and whatnot, so that people have an idea of what potentially is coming down the pike. What role does the county have? We do have some control over county zoning regulations, but we don't do a lot of county zoning right now. And that's just kind of been in longstanding practice in Campbell County. We've really resisted, in particular in the county making extra rules for people for things that they can do on their property. And so while we do have some county zoning, we also have a lot of unzoned places. And that's so there may or may not be a role for the county commission if a facility is built in the county. If a facility is built somewhere within city limits, that's a different story. That's out of our jurisdiction. But anyway, there may be some kind of role there. State law guides our decisions. Unlike, say, the city of Gillette, which has home rule via our state constitution, the county commission doesn't get to make up its own laws. The state legislature makes the laws. The county commission is considered an extension of the state and is considered part of the executive branch. The executive branch doesn't write the laws. The legislative branch writes the laws. And so as a commission, for instance, we can't enact a noise ordinance unless there's already something in state statute. We can't, there was a guy a while back who in the county, he was living on a road where there's trucks that were using their Jake brakes a lot, and he was just ticked off, and he wanted us to create an ordinance to stop people from using Jake brakes. And part of the issue is we have no authority as the county commission to make a law or to make a rule that says someone can't use their Jake brakes because state statute doesn't give us that authority. So we are subject to the laws that are written in our state. Um, and so with that, when you think of a potential company coming to Gillette, and the environmental impacts in particular that might have, the Wyoming DEQ and the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, these really are the ones who are going to play an outsized role. Whereas the county commission is probably not going to play much of a role at all. We will have a role probably in industrial siting. Um, any project that's over a certain amount of millions of dollars, I think it's like $300 million or more, goes through industrial siting, which is essentially to help the state give support to Campbell County for a massive project. We haven't had anything like this since, using industrial siting, I believe, since Dry Fork Power Station. Um, and if BWXT does in fact choose Campbell County, then there's a good likelihood that industrial siting will be involved, and that will also allow for public comment as well, additional public comment. And and obviously, as things develop, we're going to keep people informed. I'll keep people informed on social media and whatnot. Ultimately, the county does not have the statutory or legal authority to tell a business they cannot operate here, and like I said, that's a good thing. Um, that's just not something we can do. Um, I've heard some people say, that a company like BWXT, it should be put on the ballot, for the people to decide. There's nothing in the state statute that allows for anything like that. Um, and that's speaking only for myself. That's not a good road to go down. Um, we don't do that with any other businesses, right? If Walmart wanted to put a Sam's Club in town, we wouldn't require that decision to be put on the ballot to be made by the people. Um, and why is that? Well, because we don't live in a pure democracy. Um, even the minority has constitutional rights. And that is one of those things that, as someone who's an elected official, I swore an oath to protect. I swore an oath to protect the Constitution and people's constitutional rights, even if I disagree with maybe the decisions that they're doing. All right, I think this is the last question. Why is there talk of nuclear waste coming to Campbell County if the US government and industry are not proposing it and it's already illegal by state law? And I think there's a few reasons. First of all, Radiant's business model I mentioned a moment ago anticipates nuclear waste produced from their microreactors being stored on site at the manufacturing plant in bar none. And that would require a change in state law. And people see that as bringing nuclear waste that is produced outside of Wyoming back into Wyoming via these microreactors. Nuclear power plants within the state are, like I said, authorized right now and required to hold their waste on site until the federal government collects it for permanent disposal. So I think part of the discussion about nuclear waste has to do a little bit with Radiant, and even though we're not in Natrona County, we're in Campbell County. I think that's part of what's driving some of the conversation, particularly at the state legislative level. I think another reason that we're talking about this is that there's a distrust for America's governmental institutions. People just don't trust the government, and even though Trump did all of his executive orders, um, and and even though the federal government has not said that they are going to place any nuclear waste here, people are just naturally suspicious, and this goes along with kind of this postmodernism view that views any kind of a truth claim, especially the truth claims of the government, with extreme suspicion. If the government's mouth is moving, then it's probably lying. That's kind of the idea, right? And so people have, they gravitate towards conspiracies, thinking that they have the real truth. I know what they're really up to. I'm in on the secret, and let me tell you about it. And so I think there's some of that going on. around this conversation of nuclear waste as well. People just don't trust the federal government, and they think that there is a plan, and that plan is going to be executed. And they themselves, they know what the plan is, and they're going to share that with others, even though there's no evidence for it anywhere. The last thing is why is we're talking nuclear waste coming to Campbell County? I think it's also important though that we do talk about this so that we understand all aspects of the nuclear fuel cycle. The nuclear fuel cycle isn't just the front end of the fuel cycle. You've got the back end to deal with as well. And like it or not, uh, nuclear energy produces nuclear waste. Now, there's some promising things on the horizon, including being able to recycle that waste or to be able to use that spent fuel even in these newer reactors, so that nuclear waste that might have taken hundreds of thousands of years to decay with half lives in the ground might only take 300 years with new technology. That's pretty cool, and that's pretty promising. Nevertheless, it's still dangerous. And like I said earlier, when it comes to industrial processes, every industry creates waste. Every industry creates, byproducts. Every industry has risks, um, and hazards that affect people and the environment, and they must be mitigated. And the government has a role in ensuring that those companies are the ones who are legally and financially responsible, and that they are mitigating those risks, for the health and benefit and welfare and safety of the people and the environment. That's it with my presentation. This was a long one, um, but it's all out there. So there you go. So if you've watched this whole thing, you know everything that I know. If you have questions, you can follow me on Facebook. Look me up at Scott Clem, Politics. You can also contact me at my email. You can see it there, scott.clem@campbellcounty.gov. Or you can reach me on my phone number. It's 307-660-7141. Again, I hope you found some of this enlightening, and I hope that through this, maybe it generates some other questions for you that you can bring to that meeting next Thursday on September the 18th at 6 p.m. at the Gillette College Tech Center, and ask those experts the questions that you need answers to. With that, thanks. Have a good one.